If you can hear my voice, clap once. If you can hear my voice, clap twice. Yay! Okay. Sorry, I thought we were starting at 11 o'clock. We're a couple minutes late, but that's okay. It's a very full house. Welcome to our presentation on check and check out across grade levels. I am Sarah Estropola, and I'm an assistant research professor at the University of Missouri. And I have some awesome co-presenters with me today. Jana Schultz is from Independence School District. She's an assistant principal. And then Angus Kittleman, who's an assistant professor at the University of Missouri. He'll be talking about high school implementation. So let's gear up for hopefully a great presentation. So we're going to talk about check and check out. These are our learner objectives. Most of them will be geared towards like school-wide systems and how to use your data. Less about the nuts and bolts of check and check out, but how to be successful school-wide. So I'm going to start off with the very basic check and check out, what it is not. And then Jana will talk about how she has implemented it over the last several years in her school. And then Angus will talk about high school considerations, adaptations, and implementation. I want to start by addressing the elephant in the room. This is kind of a soapbox for me in relation to check and check out. Check and check out is not a points sheet. It is not a clipboard with a rating scale. That is not what it is. It is a tool to help you facilitate check and check out. But check and check out is about providing multiple opportunities throughout the day for a student to receive positive adult feedback, and then any sort of problem solving throughout the day. It's structured high quality feedback and attention with the points sheet or the daily progress report as a tool to help facilitate those conversations. Yes, reaching goals and earning points can be really motivating for students, and it's a great data collection tool, but that is not where the behavior change happens. It's in those high-quality feedback sessions with those mentors and adults. So, who is best suited for check and check out? Because it's not a point system, it's for students who thrive on positive adult attention. So along with that, it's generally also well suited for students with a lot of externalizing behavior problems or conduct disorders. So students who might argue, struggle with following directions, have trouble working with others, low attendance, maybe some low intensity fighting, or some poor self-regulation, especially if you work in a student self-monitoring component within check and check out. And again, students with externalizing problems, they're the ones who are really obviously struggling and they cause disruptions to your classroom and your teaching. And generally those students only receive negative adult feedback. So they're constantly getting office discipline referrals or they're being talked down to or negatively by their teachers. So when you enroll them in check and check out, the idea is that you're reversing that and you're creating positive feedback opportunities for students from multiple adults within the school. So how do you identify students who would be best suited for check and check out? Step one is to follow your Tier 2 procedures for reviewing your variety of data sources. That can include universal screening, office referrals, attendance records, staff or parent caregiver nominations. It should be multiple data sources from this list. And then once you've identified students who should qualify or may be at risk for additional, more intensive needs, that's when you look at your sample of students and you think, who has these externalizing problems or a conduct disorder or maybe self-regulation challenges? And I'll talk about very briefly how to help you identify students with those needs. You might also consider doing a brief functional assessment because again, these are attention-motivated students. So you want to use that need for attention and provide positive attention to help shape and mold their behavior. The Missouri PBIS website offers a very simple, brief functional assessment. You don't need a behavior specialist or somebody with applied behavior analysis skills to do these. It's very brief, very simple, and it can help you figure out why the student engages in those problem behaviors. So students whose motivation is to obtain adult attention might be a really good fit for check and check out. And then with your universal screeners, most of them have subscales attached to them that can help you identify students with those externalizing problems. So on the screen here, you can see this is what a sample report that you would get from the PBIS. And there are a series of subscales with externalizing, internalizing, and adaptive. So first you would identify students who are at risk for needing additional services, and then from there you would look at those subscales to help you identify students with externalizing risks. If they showed a need with internalizing, then maybe standard check-in, check-out would not be the best option for them. They might be better suited for some cognitive behavioral, small group social skills or something to help address those internalizing issues, or adaptive skills would be also for some other Tier 2 intervention. You can also consider including a post-intervention screening or something like a month or 6 weeks, 2 months down the line, either as a progress monitoring tool, or if you're considering fading that intervention, you can re-implement that screener to see if there's been any change that shows up for that particular student. I've included a resource here for a database across a bunch of reliable and valid screeners. If you download the slides, there's a clickable link, or I see some of you with the QR code. Again, this is free and available on the Missouri PBIS website. So, systems for implementing. The typical school-wide organization for implementing check-in, check-out starts with a building coordinator. And this is the person who does general oversight over implementing check-in, check-out. They help you identify training times, identifying facilitators, reviewing data for who should qualify for check-in, check-out, and they would monitor student outcome data, fidelity data, and we'll talk a little bit more about how that happens in a little bit. And then there are a couple of facilitators. Those are the person who the student checks in with in the morning and checks out with in the afternoon. And it's very important when you are identifying your facilitators that they should never be the student's classroom teacher. Because again, you want a variety of adults who build a positive relationship with your students. So this is particularly relevant for elementary schools when they have one primary classroom teacher. The person that they check in and out with should not be that classroom teacher. It's also important to consider who those facilitators are. They should be somebody who is compassionate and has a very sincere drive to help these students. I know that's all of us in this room, but some of us are just better at doing that than others. Another option is to allow your students to pick who their facilitator is going to be, and that does not have to be a teacher. It could be any support staff. It could be somebody, it could be a bus driver, a custodian, lunch staff, whoever that student can identify with and trust and want to receive feedback from. And then, of course, you have your students who are the ones receiving the intervention and their classroom teachers. Their classroom teachers are responsible for providing those ratings throughout the day, and the students may or may not have a responsibility towards soliciting those ratings. The teacher might initiate it, or the student. And of course, we have at-home caregivers and parents. Some versions of check-in, check-out have a home note where the teacher or the student is sent home with a note that has to be signed by their parent. One caveat that you should keep in mind if you want to communicate with parents in this way is this portion may not be appropriate for all students. And you want to think about what is the student going to get out of it, or what is the parent going to get out of it if you're communicating with them with a home note, which is typically like, did the student meet their goal for that day, or any relevant notes. You want to consider whether or not the parent might overreact if the student doesn't meet their goal or if they got some negative feedback. The last thing you want to do is put the child in a situation where they're going to experience some sort of harm at home because they had a bad day. And on the other hand, you want to think about, should the student get punished in any way, like if the home note is tied to receiving some contingent reinforcement. You don't want to make an unreliable parent or caregiver the student to suffer any sort of consequence from that. So really, you should get to know your students in the context and whether or not that's an appropriate part of their intervention. Some students might really thrive on at-home attention, so maybe sharing it with the parent would be a really good thing, but again, it could also be a bad thing. So just get to know your families and the students and their context. So now that you've identified all of your students and you're going to install check-in, check-out within your school, we recommend a school-wide training. Remember, Tier 2 can include up to 15% of the students in your school, so it's very likely that all your teachers are going to interact with the student on check-in, check-out at some point. So training your entire school, your entire staff, at least on the very basics of what this intervention is and what it is not, can really help increase your fidelity and overall effectiveness of this intervention. So at these trainings, you want to include what is check-in, check-out, what it is not, who can benefit from it, and why it's important. And of course, share research on its effectiveness. I'm not saying you have to pull out some academic journal to show some complicated graph. Your state coordinator can probably hook you up with a partner district or a partner school, and you can show their data if you don't have any yet. It can be really powerful to help increase buy-in and show a need to implement this with a high degree of fidelity in your school. Do a very brief review of the procedures for check-in, check-out, which can help you teach teachers on how to provide feedback for your students, and that you can reiterate, it's not a points sheet. It's just a way to talk to students about their behavior and to track some data. And then you can also solicit volunteers for facilitators if you explain briefly what those roles are. And beyond that initial training, provide ongoing support. So as you review your fidelity data, you can look for trends across teachers and facilitators, and without singling out an individual person, you can just provide an overall booster session to improve it. And of course, share your data. It doesn't have to be a full PD session, but you can quarterly review, like, we had such success with certain students and they have graduated out of check-in, check-out already. Like, that can be really powerful to help motivate your teachers and facilitators and school staff to continue with the program. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with the standard check-in, check-out process. So the student, if you include the home note, brings it from the previous day, they check in with the facilitator, and then they get a series of feedback sessions from their classroom teacher or teachers across the day if we're looking at elementary and high school students. At the end of the day, they check out with the facilitator where they review their ratings from their teacher, check maybe if they met their goal, and then they may have a home note that goes home to talk to their parents about their progress. And at each one of these major components of this intervention, you should be periodically collecting fidelity data because each of these steps in the process include either different data or different procedures for those students and teachers or facilitators working through the intervention. And what's great is the daily progress report can give you a ton of fidelity data. So this is not any extra work, but you can get a lot of information about whether or not the intervention is put into place as it's designed. So we can look at, this is another tool, a fidelity tool that is available on the Missouri PBIS website. There's a link to it at the bottom of the slide. But you can look at, did the student get rated every single period? Did they get rated every single day? Did they go through a check-in and a check-out with a facilitator? So you can look at those very basic components to see, is it in place? And you can look at trends across an entire week or across a single day. And again, this is something that can happen without a lot of extra effort because this daily progress report is already built in as a component of this intervention. But you can't get all the information you need from the daily progress report because remember, that is a tool to facilitate conversations, which can't actually give you any information about those conversations that are happening between the teacher or facilitator and the student. So we also recommend doing some sort of observation periodically for each facilitator, for a check-in session, for a check-out session, and at least once for a teacher as they're providing feedback during the class period or at the end of a class period. And what this can do is it can ensure that they are covering all the necessary components for quality and effective feedback. And there are examples on the PBIS website, or you can reach out and we can provide some of those checklists. And this is probably best suited for the check-in, check-out coordinator, and they can do this periodically throughout the school year. However, we do recommend that you do this once in the first week or two of implementation. And that is because you don't want them to get into a routine of not providing effective feedback, because that doesn't help anybody, the students or the check-in, check-out program as a whole. So now you have collected fidelity data from the daily progress reports, and you've done direct observation fidelity checks. And what you should do with that data, you should transfer it to a spreadsheet, responses for each item. That way you can look at trends across your entire school to see whether or not you're having an issue like with the same item across your entire school. And that could indicate a problem with your initial training, or it could be a problem with the system that you've set up. So you can make changes to your system, or you could do some retrainings. If it's an individual teacher who's having a problem with a certain area, you should address it immediately. And again, you can do that individually, informally, and just say, hey, make sure you remember to end your feedback session with something positive for the student so they can get going more positively, and explain why. If you're concerned about singling out a teacher and they're like bombing their fidelity, you can also just get a group of teachers. Like you can do it by department, you can do it school-wide, just so you're not singling out that individual person. So you can gradually try and correct some of those fidelity concerns. And then if we're looking at student outcome data, we recommend you should always collect baseline data first before implementing check-in, check-out. Our baseline data can tell us if the intervention has actually made any kind of change on that student's behavior. So to do baseline, the teacher will do the ratings by themselves with no feedback to the student. And those teacher ratings can tell us, where the teacher sees the student right now, and then we can look at that data later on when the student actually engages in check-in, check-out and gets those feedback sessions. And your DPR data, what's really great about that is that can be your outcome measure too. So you can put all that data into a spreadsheet and review it weekly or bi-weekly with your Tier 2 team to see if that student's actually making any progress. And with that, check-in, check-out is not a life sentence. How many of you in your districts have kiddos who have been on check-in, check-out for years? Yeah. So that is not what it is intended to be. Check-in, check-out should be, a few months at best. And if the student is not making progress, then you should figure out something else to do with them. And if they are making progress, you can graduate them off of the program. And I'm going to share with you a very brief framework for doing either of those, like fading it away or intensifying it to see what happens. So if students are having a really positive response to check-in, check-out, you can make iterative changes to their plan. You can increase their goal by 5 to 10% until they're meeting a maximum criterion. One caveat with that is 100% is not always advisable. You don't need to create an anxiety problem with that student thinking that they have to be perfect. So maybe just make it 95%, depending on what those behaviors are. You can reduce the reduce the frequency of teacher feedback. So if the student is getting feedback 5 times a day, take it down to 4 for a week. Then take it down to 3 for a week. Or you can also remove either the check-in or the check-out. One thing that you should always keep in mind when you're fading an intervention such as check-in, check-out, you should never fade feedback completely. You should always be providing high quality feedback to all of your students. That's not something that needs to go away. But it's not something that necessarily has to be systematically tracked like in check-in, check-out. And then if the student is really struggling to make any changes or any progress within check-in, check-out, after a week or so, you want to keep an eye on that data, and there are some changes that you can make. You could consider reducing the goal, so maybe it was just way too hard for them to start out with, and they're just not experiencing any success, so they're not building any positive self-efficacy. You could add a facilitator check-in midday. So at lunchtime, maybe they have another opportunity to meet with that really awesome facilitator who they really love and they're motivated by. And you can add a reinforcement contingency. So if they meet their goal for the first half of the day, they meet with their facilitator and they get some sort of prize. Do the same thing at the other half of the day, or just add it for the entire day. You can also include student self-ratings. So if the student really needs to be able to internalize and recognize these behaviors for themselves, you can have them rate for themselves when the teacher also rates them. And Angus will talk about that in a little bit. And throughout this process, you have to continue collecting data. You want to see if your changes are making any difference, and even if you're fading it and the student is doing really well, continue progress monitoring as you have been, because you still need to see if you're fading too quickly and the student regresses, or if the fading is going really well and you need to continue phasing out, check in, check out. And with that, I will pass it over to Jana.
All right, like Sarah said, my name is Jana Schultz, and I'm an assistant principal at Independence Elementary School. I'm in the Francis House School District in St. Charles, Missouri. I've been an assistant principal there for the past 15 years, and prior to that, I taught 3rd and 4th grade in a variety of schools in Missouri and actually in Illinois as well. Being at Independence for the past 15 years, I've come to really appreciate that we do value both character education and PBIS. We are a state and national school of character in Missouri, which basically just means that we do a lot of intentional teaching of character education. We've found that that does really just carry over really seamlessly to PBIS because our core character words become our expectations matrix components, and so it really does just carry over pretty seamlessly. So we also do value PBIS, especially the Tier 1 systems of having expectations and rules, procedures, all of those parts, and Tier 2 with specifically check-in, check-out, which is what I'm here to talk to you guys about, how we've implemented check-in, check-out in our building. So I want to tell you a story about a student named Lucas. Lucas was a first grade student, and his teacher was already having concerns with him within the first month of the school year because he had already received 1 office referral, and the teacher knew that in kindergarten he had had 7 office referrals for behaviors like not keeping his hands to himself at recess, classroom disruptions, defiance. I think he vandalized the bathroom once. So there were already some concerns, and the teacher and the counselor were both concerned that he was going to be on the same path that he was on in kindergarten. So we wanted to do something about it to try to get ahead of it and support him better. And so this roadmap kind of gives a glimpse of the steps that we take to initially consider a student for check-in, check-out, and then the steps along the way or the stops along the way that we take to get ready to start the program for the student. So our first step is through a care team meeting. At Independence, we can initiate care team meetings in one of 2 ways. Our Tier 2 intervention team does meet monthly, and we review our school-wide data, so that includes our social emotional screener. We use the SABRS screener 3 times a year. It also includes just looking at office referral, nurse visit, and just anecdotal data points that our counselors kind of notice throughout the school year. But for Lucas, his care team meeting came from his teacher making a request for the meeting. We have our care team request form just through a Google form that's on every teacher's laptop. It gets pushed out through our technology department, and they just include basic information to get the referral started. And so you can see we have our concerns include academic, social, emotional behavior. Our care team meetings are for either any of those, so we don't have a separate academic care team or a separate behavior, because we really just think about the whole child. So Lucas's teacher noted that she was having behavioral concerns and academic because she felt like the behaviors were impacting his learning. And then she was able to quickly note some of the things that she had tried for Tier 1 interventions already within the first month of the school year. When we got the care team meeting scheduled, our care team does consist of a principal, counselor. We have an educational support counselor that's a certified licensed therapist, and then a support staff of a behavior support specialist, and then of course classroom teacher is a part of the meeting as well. We have a very specific process for the care team meeting with specific forms that we use to help guide the meeting so that we stay on track so we can get to the problem solving and the now what part of that meeting. So we start with the initial care team meeting. We start with the student's history. Since we had Lucas in kindergarten, we had a pretty thorough school history for him. We knew that he had been with us. We knew he had had 7 office referrals. We knew what his academic progress was looking like. We talked about his family history. We knew his parents were not together. They were each remarried, but co-parenting very effectively, and both sets of parents wanted to be a part of his team and wanted to team with us. We were able to talk about his strengths, so we knew that he was funny and could be friendly and really wanted and was creative. His art teacher said he did really great work in art class, so we talked about some of his strengths. And then we dug deeper into the concerns about his behavior and his academics. Another part that we added last year was a parent input form. So when we schedule a care team meeting, we don't always invite the parent to the first meeting, but we do send the parents a form where they can just provide input to us about the concerns maybe that they're having or the strengths of their student or whatever different ideas they want to share. So we review that information. We also talk about past interventions. So for Lucas, we knew that he had been having scheduled breaks with his counselor last year and that the counselor was kind of working with him and his family when he was in kindergarten. And then we knew currently for first grade he was going to start reading recovery because his reading progress was just not where we wanted it to be. And then our care team meeting does carry on. We do an assessment of lagging skills and unsolved problems. That's by Dr. Ross Green. It's basically a checklist where the team goes through and identifies any lagging skills that we saw that Lucas might have. This is really helpful to kind of help decide maybe what the function of the behavior might be, or also help you decide on a goal for the student. I don't know about you guys, but I've been in meetings before where all you do is talk about all the problems and don't really get to the goal. And so this helps you narrow it down so that we can have a focus whenever we leave that meeting. So for Lucas, we figured out and thought that most of his classroom disruptions were from just wanting that adult attention. We saw that carrying over to recess too, because he was having those recess problems. Well, he was getting attention from kids, even though it was negative, and he was getting it from the recess teachers. And so our goal for him was to try to reduce those classroom disruptions. And so then we agreed that check-in, check-out would be the appropriate intervention for him since it seemed to be attention-seeking in nature. So at that point in the care team, since we knew check-in, check-out was what we wanted to do for him, I'm the coordinator, and so Sarah kind of explained the role of a coordinator. So in that role, we talked about who his facilitator would be. We knew he had a relationship with his counselor, so that made sense for her to be the facilitator, and she was, of course, willing to do that. And then I scheduled a training with his check-in, check-out team so that they could understand what their next steps would be. So in the training, I provided the team a copy of our check-in, check-out handbook, and that kind of just gives an overview of the roles and responsibilities for each person and how to use a daily progress report and how to use the home report. And then, of course, we were in person, so I really outlined that for each person during the training. And then I explained the role of each team member. I explained how that secret scoring works, where the student's not getting feedback within about the first 3 or 4 days, so we can get that baseline data. I explained how we use that daily progress report, that it should be positive in nature, how to score it, reiterated the value of the form isn't really all about the points, it's more about the interaction between the student and the teacher periodically throughout the day. And then at that time, I had the teacher and the facilitator agree on a schedule for Lucas for when he would go do his check-in and when he would go do his check-out. So really working on establishing that system so that everybody knew their role and everybody knew when Lucas would be going to do his check-in and check-out. And then I talked to the teacher about providing that training with Lucas so that he would know his part in the whole system as well. Again, as the coordinator, one of my big roles is in communication, and that's one of the biggest keys is being able to communicate with his team. So I make sure I have regular and consistent communication with both the teacher and the facilitator about his daily goal. Once we have the daily progress reports coming in and we have data that's been rolling in that we've been keeping track of, I share that data bi-weekly with his team so we can monitor how things are going. And whenever I notice anything that maybe the team needs feedback on, I provide that. So, interesting story about Lucas was that his baseline goal was 70%. And as the daily progress reports were coming through, I was noticing that his daily goal was changing to like 75% or 80%. And so I had to communicate and talk to the teacher and facilitator to find out what was going on with the goal, because it's supposed to stay at 70% for about 5 or 6 weeks. Well, they shared with me that he had been convincing them to change his goal because he was feeling like he's gonna have a great day, so he wanted his goal to be higher. So while we appreciated his eagerness to do better, we wanted to keep that goal at 70% to make sure he is being consistent with reaching or exceeding that goal. Another role as a coordinator is to make sure that people are equipped with the materials and resources that we need for check-in, check-out. Excuse me. So like you heard earlier, there's the daily progress report and the daily home report. I make sure that the team has the daily progress report through a Google document that they can edit to reflect their day and their schedule. It does have our 4 core character words, our expectations on it as well. And then also on the daily progress report, I really like the component of there are little cues for the facilitators so they can know kind of like and remember things to say when they're checking in and things to say when they're checking out. And then as well as the daily home report, just making sure they have these resources ready. The top example on the top is Lucas's form, his progress report. His teacher set up the system where his is just on his desk ready for him when he comes in the morning. He knows that routine of come in, unpack, grab my form, go check in. Another example is a teacher has just like a clear hanging file and her students' forms are just in that file every day, and he just knows his routine of getting one of those out of the file and going to his check-in person. And she even put a note, this particular student has a different check-in person and a different check-out person, and so she just put a note on there for the student to see and remind him who his check-in and check-out people are. And then one additional role as the coordinator, we get all the fun stuff. I get to really keep track of the data, so I make sure in that communication that the facilitator knows where to turn in all the daily progress reports at the end of each week. So I communicate out a plan that I have right outside my door, a little mailbox with individual student folders in it, and the facilitator just brings those down at the end of the week, puts them in the folders, and then I am able to enter that data into an Excel sheet. You can see an example of one of Lucas's forms. He exceeded his goal. He got 91% that day, and you can see all the little notes of positive feedback that the teacher provided on his form for the facilitator to see. They don't always all look like that, but that just was a really good example of a lot of positive feedback. And then I take all of the data and enter it into an Excel sheet that automatically calculates each section of the day as well as a daily overall average, like a rolling average. And then needing the role to be able to communicate, I am able to easily communicate with his team on a biweekly basis what his current average is. Makes it really quick and easy. So once we had that care team meeting and people were trained and I've done my part in communicating and making sure people have the resources that they need, we're ready to start. And so the teacher did that secret scoring for 3 days to collect that baseline data. We shared that baseline data with the facilitator and the parent, and I sent one kind of final email that has the links to the daily progress reports and the home report, as well as 2 little quick training videos that really model how like the teacher's role with the student during the day and the facilitator's role with the student during checking in and checking out. They're like quick, like 3-minute videos. Just kind of send that as one last effort, and then we were ready for Lucas to start. So his teacher had his sheet ready for him. He went to his facilitator. She provided those words of encouragement, talked about what his day was going to look like, and then he went back to class. Throughout the day, the teacher provided those check-ins at 4 different times during the day, and then at the end of the day, he went to his facilitator to check out. At that time, the facilitator calculated his daily percent, reviewed his day, really just provided words of encouragement and talked about maybe like some next steps or things to work on for tomorrow, and then filled out with his kind of input his daily home report as well. Once you have that first week out of the way, you've got some of your kinks worked out, you're actually ready to like be in full implementation for the student. And so these things are just kind of ongoing. The teacher and the facilitator to continue to partner to make sure that the student's following their schedule the way that they intended for it to happen. Being the coordinator and really needing to provide that feedback and follow up, I did notice for a student this year that I was missing some of the daily progress reports. And so when I reached out to find out what was happening, we discovered that the student was coming to school late on some days, and we didn't establish a system for what happens whenever somebody's tardy. So the teacher just didn't send him because she didn't know if the facilitator was ready or available. So they had to work through that to decide a plan for what to do when he comes in late. So the student just continues to follow his schedule, and I just continue to monitor and communicate with the team. And then at about a 6-week mark, that's when we have a data review. So we pull that care team meeting back together, and we reviewed Lucas's data and talked about next steps and adjustments. For Lucas, we knew that he was exceeding his 70% goal, so we were ready to add 10% to his goal. So we raised it to 80%, and he just really continued to have a lot of progress. He eventually got to where he was self-monitoring. He was reporting honestly. Recess teachers were noticing that like he was really keeping his hands to himself. His teacher noted that he was engaged in class a lot more. And so really just that positive feedback was just something that was really helping him. So check in, check out was an appropriate intervention for Lucas, and we were really pleased with his results. His parents were pleased with his results. And we do continue to see a lot of success with check in, check out currently in our school. Like I mentioned, we have that Tier 2 team that really looks at that overall building data. So once we gave our social emotional screener, we identified 4 students that we thought maybe check in, check out would be an appropriate intervention for them. We got them started in the program this school year, and so far they're showing to be pretty successful in it as well. I actually had one teacher kind of 2 weeks into the program was commenting to me about how well the student is doing and how much improvement she's already seen, and we jokingly talked about the power of that piece of paper. But really, all jokes aside about the piece of paper, we know it's more about the piece of paper. It's really just about those positive exchanges that the teacher and the student are having with each other. It increases the relationship, and we all know when students have that positive relationship with people at school, they feel more connected and have that sense of belonging, so you're going to see an improvement with their behavior. So if check in, check out is something that you want to do, I really do just recommend that you really think through your systems and your procedures so that everybody knows what to expect, and then your program can be efficient and effective for all the students that you place into it. So now you get to talk about high school.
All right, can everyone hear me? Awesome. Who's here trying to implement check in, check out in middle or high schools? Can you raise your hand? Okay, great. So hopefully I'm speaking to everybody, but hopefully I'm speaking to you too specifically. So, one thing that was really nice is if you went to the keynote today, you had 2 awesome students that were talking about student engagement, student participation, and really PBIS and multi-tiered systems. But I want you to keep kind of thinking about how that relates to what's their participation look like in high schools and middle schools, and how can they take student ownership in the check-in, check-out process. So real quick, as a small caveat, I've been working with schools, and a team of researchers have been working with schools to really make check-in, check-out work in high schools. And so I would be remiss if I didn't call out some of these researchers that have just been doing some excellent work in this area. You can see them on the screen. This work's really been federally funded on multiple research grants, and really just working with schools to figure out how to adapt check-in, check-out for the high school context and for the middle school. So real quick, some of this work really started really trying to get a sense of who was implementing check-in, check-out in the high schools, how often and where it was occurring. And so we did a survey early on back in 2018, really just kind of seeing, are you implementing, where are you implementing at in the US? And you can kind of see some bullet points right there of just kind of where we did the survey. And we learned some neat lessons that kind of informed some of the early development work, making check and check out work. And so some of this is the majority of high schools were pretty early on in the implementation process. So they haven't been implementing too often. Most of them were using it really in their 9th grade and 10th grade levels, really as that transition piece. So you can think about all the transitions students face from 8th grade to 9th grade, bigger contexts, new peers, developing relationships, having to get those organizational skills about showing up on time, where are classes. And then we found out that a lot of them were making adaptations to check and check out, not necessarily the core features, the importance of relationships between teachers and students, but really making modifications to the structure of it to make sure it was working in high schools and that it could be done. And we really learned a lot of important lessons from that really informed some of the development work and some of the work we worked with high schools to implement that. Now, I said that a lot of, there was a pretty small sample of high schools implementing. There was only 18 that we surveyed, so that's a pretty small group. And I know this is a lot of data here to show. And sorry for those in the back room. This is going to be hard to see. Hopefully you can see it on your PDFs. But I just want to kind of get your minds thinking about, well, not only are high schools, few of them are implementing, but there's also how many students can you support at any one time on check and check out? So it's almost speaking to like a school capacity question, like what's feasible, what's doable, and you can think about how many students are you supporting? And so what you see on the left here is elementary schools, and there's a large number, you can see ranging from 260 to over 1,000 in what month those schools are supporting students. And then you can see the average numbers of students supported in those elementary schools. So for elementary, you're seeing between 4 to about 9 students in any one month in any one school. And then if you go way over there to the high schools, you can see there's a lot fewer high schools implementing. It's from between about 3 to 25 to 30. And you can see the range of students they're supporting is around 6. So you can say, wow, well, that doesn't quite, make sense. There's larger schools. They should be able to have more students identified in high schools. Why aren't we supporting just as much as elementary or even more, right? And I think that kind of informs some of the work about, well, how can we make check and check out work a little bit better in high schools? And so I'm going to share a logic model that was developed by really smart people, Bridget Flannery and Mimi McGrath-Cateo, and then I really want to talk just about why are high schools different? And I think some of this relates to middle schools too. But I think 3 things that they really pointed out that we have to really take under consideration when we're implementing check and check out in high schools. One is the size, right? It's a larger campus, multiple buildings. Sometimes it's just like a university context. You're walking all the way across campus. The culture. So again, when we think about elementary school students, we're thinking about really a strong emphasis on you have one teacher, you're working on relationships, you're working on don't do this, transitions, we're working on engagement. All those things are really important, but we have this added focus on academics. So how are these skills that we're working with applying to English class and science class and math class? Much more focus on academics. And then the developmental level, when we're thinking about check and check out, I originally was really ambitious, and I tried to have a 9th grade student use a paper point card, and I gave them that point card in their class, and I said, this is the point card you're going to use. And they looked at this big point card and they said, oh, okay. And then they went to the first class and went, so like the paper point card being a large format, you can see in a 9th grade, 10th graders, that could be seen by peers as stigmatizing a little bit. And so not necessarily to everybody, but to some peers, they might not want to carry that around sometimes. So we really need to put that in the developmental context. And then we also think about our foundational systems in high schools. These are that we're using data from decision making. Sarah discussed this already earlier on. We still want to do those things. We still want to have leadership teams that meet regularly to review progress about when to fade, when to intensify supports on check and check out. When can they leave so they're not a life sentence, as Sarah was saying? How do we know when those decision rules are being made? And then what are those core features? We don't necessarily want to change the core features that make check and check out effective. We just want to make sure they work in this context. And then again, in high schools, we're really focused on increasing engagement in science and math classes. So we focus on that. Now, Sarah already showed this really great graphic, and I love this graphic. I was like, this is the coolest thing. So I said, I'm not going to make a new graphic that Sarah made. I'm just going to change it slightly about how we might think about it in the high school context when we're checking in. Now, when we're thinking in elementary, there's probably going to be one teacher, right? Where the student and teacher get multiple checks during the day, maybe every 2 hours, 3 hours. They review the expectations, the school-wide expectations, get feedback, and then they come back and do it again. But in high schools, there's A and B days. They don't have the same classes every day. They don't have the same teachers every day. So instead of having one teacher check in multiple times, we got to think about having 5 to 7 to 8 teachers only do it once, maybe every other day. And it really kind of changes up how we train teachers to do this check-in, check-out process because they don't get as many opportunities with a student to do it. And so building fluency with how to do check-in, check-out becomes pretty important. So again, you might have math teacher that student checks in with at the beginning. Then you might have science, language arts, maybe an advisory class, or a flex, that's that college and career readiness course. But then on the B day, maybe this is Tuesday, well, then they have world history, foreign language, PE, art. So when you're thinking about installing a check-in, check-out system, you really have to think about how do I implement this not only with my student, but across all these other teachers. How many students will they have? How often will they have to provide feedback? I also think, getting back to that culture piece that we discussed earlier, we also think about how can high schools check in, but some of those school-wide expectations, maybe they have sub-goals that are really more academic focused. So an example of this might be an academic behavior along with the school-wide expectation, right? So if being engaged is a school-wide expectation, what does that look like in science class? What does that look like in math class? How can we talk about working with peers in the classroom? So we learned this from the survey work too, that when they were implementing check-in, check-out with those schools that were testing it out, a lot of times they were pairing check-in, check-out with maybe an academic seminar class or a tutoring study skills class. So they were kind of like check-in, check-out plus in some ways. And I think that we really want to think about, again, we want to kind of align that academic focus and make it clear not only to the students about how these goals are important for continuing on post-secondary college, but also to the teachers, how these align with what they're teaching in their academic core classes. I think it helps with that buy-in piece. There's also an important part, and again, this is where I really want to center on that student ownership. When you set these sub-goals around why are these important for you, and how can these help you, build friendships in your classrooms? How can these help you in college to build teacher relationships and teacher allies so that if something happens where you can't show up and maybe you're 15 minutes late to a quiz, you kind of have that investment with the teacher where you have a relationship and there's this certain level of, I know you're working really hard, you come to school every day, but you really have this kind of collaborative relationships with teachers. So we do a lot more when we're working with high schools is helping students to identify those goals that they're going to work on and then to check in and to modify those. What's working, what's not working, and to really get that feedback built into the check-in, check-out process when the students are checking in with coordinators during the day. So it's really important to set the goals, have students take on more ownership with monitoring those goals, and then also having teachers, and then to helping them self-evaluate, how am I doing on those goals as a 9th grade student? So I'm going to show a little bit how we've been doing that with a different application. But I just want to, again, compare this developmental level in high schools again with what a progress report card might work like. So on the left side, this is a pretty standard one that might work in elementary schools where you might have be respectful, be responsible, and be safe. And you might have your content areas, and it might be smiley faces. It might be whatever the student likes using. This is one card, though, that a high school was using that we worked with, where they had a teacher side and a student side, where they were really focusing on having the student rate themselves and then take it up to the teacher and said, this is how I think I was doing on these goals that I'm working on. How do you think I was doing? And then that really creates this kind of cool facilitative dialogue where it almost prompts that conversation, right? Now it really isn't around the point card, as Sarah was saying. It's really around this mismatch between what I thought I was being self-aware and what you thought I was being self-aware. And then it's like, we are not agreeing here. Why is that? And then that really will create that kind of dialogue piece. And again, I think it's kind of funny with high schools too. It's great, but I think sometimes our school-wide expectations, they can be a little different. You know, in elementary, it might be respect, responsible, and safe, and that definitely works in high schools. But oftentimes I see kind of these skills that are more like self-aware, honest, appreciative. And those are great school-wide expectations, persistence. But I think having clear examples about what that looks like for those students, what does persistence look like in this classroom? I think that's something that science teachers and English teachers can really describe and share with the students. So this is really one great example of another school that was moving, that didn't use a paper point card in high schools. They were using a Google Docs, and I know we've talked about Google Docs a couple times, but this is one a high school was using where they could pull up on their iPads, and then they could enter in the scores for the student. And the neat thing about this Google Docs form is any teacher could open up the same the scorecard, so you could really see implementation, like fidelity of which teachers are doing it and which periods. So it was kind of a neat little part. We've talked a little bit about notes home. Sarah talked about how you want to be like mindful of doing those notes home, whether this is something the student wants to work on, whether it's a positive relationship, not punishing. I think we've really been thinking about that in high schools as well, as do you want your parents to see this? Is there efficient ways that we can send these? Does it come through emails, phone, text messages? How can we deliver that information? And so in the last a couple minutes here, I just want to walk through one case example where we worked with 3 students in one high school. And I want to kind of show like their participation patterns because I think it's really fascinating in some ways. So this is some of our evaluation work we've been doing on this team to really kind of evaluate one of these check-in, check-out programs. But we worked with 3 students, and we just wanted to say this kind of modified check-in, check-out that we were working with, could it be implemented by the school staff and students? Because students have to take ownership. Did it have a meaningful impact on student outcomes, specifically classroom engagement? And then was it perceived as something that they would want to continue doing in their schools? And so we worked with 3 students. These are random names, so we don't identify the students in the school. This is Tracy, John, and Dan. 2 of the students did have IEPs, 1 did not. And we wanted to look at their impact in core content classes in high school. So for Tracy, it was English and science, and you can see for the other students what that looked like. What we found out is once they started participating, we kind of measured fidelity in a pretty unique way. We said, did they check in at the beginning of the day? Did they check out? And they used an app so we could see if they were checking in and check out. And then did they greet their teacher in every period? Did they rate themselves on the point card? And then did they go up to the teachers and have them rate them on the point card? So there was a lot of components that the student actually had to take ownership of. This was really student-driven. And then the teachers participated with providing that feedback. And what we did this over 2 school years. This was kind of fun because we started doing this work before the COVID pandemic, and then as students were returning back. So we call this our COVID check-in, check-out implementation study in some ways. But this is what the point card looked like that we were working with. And so this is what it would look like for a student. Did I greet my teacher? Yes, no, and they responded. And then did I respect self? And you can see there was a sub-goal of maybe on time. That's how I respected my own self. And then they rated themselves. And then this is what it looked like for teachers. They could see the student's score, and that allowed them to provide score. Did they greet you? And then provide their score. But it really gave that kind of nice comparison piece. The neat thing is we had a range of participation, so I'm going to move past this just in the interest of time, but I really want to show this really cool graph. And so this is a lot of data, but what you're seeing here is the participation for Tracy up top, for John in the middle, and then for Dan at the bottom, and this is their level of classroom engagement. And so when you see those squiggly lines in the middle, on the left side is how well they were engaged in 2 classrooms before and how well they were engaged after on the right side. And what you can see is there was higher levels of engagement after participation. Now, what you might say is like, wow, well, there seems to be a lot of variability. Even though it's more participation, there's a lot of variability. And I was like, yes, there is. And then if you break that out by different classes that they participated in, you actually see different participation rates by different classrooms they were using check-in, check-out. So you can see that the bold was one classroom, and then the dotted lines were another classroom. And what you're seeing is increases in both, but some classrooms, their participation was lower before check-in, check-out, and that bumped up after check-in, check-out. And I think that's a really kind of unique story in high schools, is like a student's participation or engagement varies from period to period to period. And I think it makes sense about how check-in, check-out, you have to work with each teacher, and maybe their participation or their participation in check-in, check-out has to be the same at every classroom period. Maybe it needs to be focused on certain periods. You know, it's really interesting to see about where they're having trouble and who they're having trouble with and how we can help them to kind of take ownership of that and increase that engagement level. So in the last 3 minutes here, I just want to ask you all for a second, and we'll pull you back in about 1 minute. But how does your check-in, check-out system compare, and what are some of the things you have been doing? So talk amongst yourselves for 2 minutes, and then we'd love to hear maybe one shout-out. All right, if you can hear my voice, clap once. If you can hear my voice, clap twice. All right, thank you all very much. Could I just get one kind of share-out that maybe you're discussing? Is there someone that would like to just talk? Yes, right there in the middle. Yeah. That's cool.
The one thing that was not a surprise to me, and I heard it from multiple of the presenters, was that it's not a life sentence, right? It's not a life sentence. It's a short-term intervention. We know 6 weeks of data collection, and then you review. However, in my school, I do have many members of our Tier 2 team, including counselors, social workers, things like that, where when there are students that have a dictated need for regular check-ins, whether that be through their 504 or just reports from previous years, they say, okay, great, we've got check-in, check-out, give them to Kylie, that's me. And I've been kind of fighting that battle, butting heads with these people, saying that is not the purpose of this intervention. It is not for those students, for those long, you've got kids who have kids that ask for a check-in, check-out, right? So that is separate. So do you have any tool strategies or suggestions to help me when I go back?
Yeah, that's great. I was trying to think about.
I would look at function. Okay. Like, is there anything else I can do for the student? And maybe do some withdrawals of that. Like the feedback, withdraw it, take it away, and see, is this making a difference for that student's behavior? And if it's not, if the student's behavior stays level after you take it away, then it's probably not necessary anymore. Mm-hmm. If the student's behavior tanks, if you take it away, then it's probably a support that they should continue to have.
And I think, too, a lot of Tier 3 supports have a point system that they still use because it's a very efficient way to monitor fidelity and to monitor some outcomes. So as long as they're not confusing that this is check-in, check-out, adding on a point card to a Tier 3 level intervention, that's pretty common practice, too, in some ways as well.
Yeah, and like I said, when you're withdrawing or trying to graduate a student from a check-in, check-out or similar process, you don't ever want to completely remove feedback, right? In whatever way that's happening. And a lot of students with more intensive support needs, like 504s or IEPs, structured feedback could just be a part of their program. But if it's a life sentence, then maybe that should be transferred to a special education teacher or a school counselor or something.
Thank you all very much. Have a great sessions. Thank you.